Hey minions, this is Bobbie Carlton. I'm the founder of Innovation Nights, and today we are very excited to have the authors of Boston Made: From Revolution to Robotics, Innovations That Change the World. And it's a new book about the inventions and innovations that have made Boston the powerhouse we are today. So let's welcome Dr. Robert Krim and Alan Earls to the program today. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So, Bob, Alan?
Why don't you go ahead, Bob?
Okay. I'm Dr. Bob Krim and spent 20 years studying innovation in Boston, largely in an organization that I had, Boston History and Innovation Collaborative, which worked on innovations and that would be interesting to people around the city. And then most recently, I've been teaching at Framingham State University, teaching innovation and entrepreneurship and those sorts of things. So that's a little bit about me.
And Alan?
I'm Alan Earls. I sort of grew up in the shadow of Route 128 as a little kid and the space race and all that stuff, and got very interested in innovation in general. I ended up working for a couple of small, innovative startup companies, making medical equipment and scientific gear, and then ended up at another startup company, a newspaper called Mass High Tech. They reported on the Massachusetts Miracle in the 1980s, which was all about high tech and innovative companies and the like. And that got me really, really interested in where all this stuff came from. And I made a point of trying to track down some of the founding fathers and sometimes founding mothers of the sort of tech scene in the region. And later fulfilled in part an ambition to write a little book about Route 128, which I did for Arcadia Publishing. And at the Charles River Museum of Industry, put together an exhibit about Route 128. And along the way, I ran into Bob and then ended up running into his dad, who was the archivist at Raytheon when I was writing a book about Raytheon. So our paths crossed, and we haven't been able to uncross them since.
Thank God.
And that's actually where Alan and I met too.
The book wouldn't have happened if it weren't Alan agreeing to co-author with me along the way. And he brought such a background in terms of being able to describe the technology side as well as the history side. Yeah.
That's
Bob was
great.
very kind.
So, really, I mean, we are talking about from the telephone to the COVID vaccine. New England and Boston in particular have just been the source for important innovations for decades. And what is it about Boston? What is it about this area that supports so much innovation and creativity?
Well, we believe that some of what it is about Boston is the fact that the innovation side goes back 400 years. Not just to the telephone 130 years or whatever away, and that there has been an incredible history of innovations that have changed the nation and the world that come out of this area, from the first public school to the COVID anti-COVID Moderna vaccine. So it's a wonderful story.
Yeah, no matter where you look, there are more stories to be found. Bob and his team researched 400 of them, but there are so many more. I live blocks away from Franklin, Massachusetts Library, which claims, I think it's been pretty much legitimized, to be the first free public library in the U.S. It's a pretty big innovation right there for one small town. And, no matter where you look, you keep finding more of these. It's remarkable.
That's great. Now, you guys wrote about 50 different innovations. Any personal favorites?
Well, I think that there are some in the more recent years that are interesting. I think of Sidney Farber and his innovation. He's really the modern father of chemotherapy. And when he started working in the mid-1940s in the basement of Children's Hospital on childhood leukemia, 85% of the children who came in didn't make it. And 30 years later, you look at what they had done with childhood leukemia based on his early work, and 85% survived. It's, in my mind, the ultimate wonderful Boston story in terms of how somebody goes against the grain, which he certainly did. And we could get into that more if you wanted to. And it took a lot of heat for not being, people felt that his ideas weren't the right ones. And he turned out to be just really the savior of kids and childhood leukemia, as well as developing chemotherapy. So Dana-Farber Cancer Center and the Jimmy Fund along the way, this has been a Boston written story all the way, and brought the baseball teams into cancer research and brought cancer research into the other side as well.
That's great. What about you, Alan? Any particular favorites you can point to?
Well, there are a lot to choose from. I think my favorite, because it's so it's around us, it's what we're using right now, the internet, and Boston's role in that. Like anything else, something as profound as that has a lot of parents, and I know Al Gore claimed to be one of them, I think, at one point, way back when. But really, some of the key technology came out of MIT, and particularly the wherewithal to actually apply it, like this idea of packet switching, which means instead of a wire carrying one signal for forever, it can carry thousands that are constantly going back and forth and being reassembled for the user at each end. That's how the internet works. That was pioneered by folks like J.C.R. Licklider, who went off to the Defense Advanced Research Program and found funding to create this experimental internet. Engineers at Old Beranek and Newman, which at the time was kind of a boutique small tech company in Cambridge. I guess it was really just out of its startup phase. They helped set up this very, very first experimental internet in late 69, 70. And, at the time, nobody thought it was going to amount to anything. And they said, ho hum. But, here we are, obviously. So I love that one. It's got, against the odds and all new tech and things like that.
That's great. Now, 400 is what you guys, I think, kind of culled it down from. Were there any that kind of ended up on the cutting room floor that you're like, I wish we had room for that one?
Well, I'm not sure that I would say on the cutting room floor, but certainly how Moderna was able to take what was sort of a theoretical piece that they had been working on trying to use. And in February of last year and into March, really turned that in from something which they had been doing research on, but had never made it. And it's a story of how they made it and them coming up with almost $1 billion in funding to do it. And any innovation that has been sort of around for a while but hasn't yet been brought out to the public, and then is able to raise that amount and change millions of people's lives, which is happening right now as a result of it. That is a story that we wish we were being published later. We wish we weren't being published today, because that would be the lead story in the book. But it indicates a lot of that innovation is a combination of 4 or 5 things. It's one thing to invent the theory and do some early work on it. It's another thing to have millions of shots be the important thing that people are most looking for in their lives right now.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen the use of the word supply chain used in the mass media as much as I have over the past year.
It's so true.
Right.
Absolutely. It's like you used to see that all the time in all the manufacturing publications and stuff that I work with a lot. But now seeing it, kind of in the everyday newspaper is a little bit of a, oh, look at that. Now everybody's worried about it.
It's true.
One of the things that a lot of people talk about when it comes to Boston is how much of an impact the educational institutions have here. You know, we have so many universities right in Boston, Cambridge proper. And what kind of impact does that have on the entrepreneurial community?
Well, should I take this, Alan, or? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
So in looking at 50 out of the 400, we looked at 24 different theories about that, and we interviewed hundreds to come up with these 24 about why the city is one of the most innovative in the world and has all these different innovations. And what we found along the way is the universities play a role, but it isn't always the lead role when you actually come to the innovation that needs to be put together. The early thing of the early work and prototypes, some of that done in the university, certainly on biotech and some in technology. But for the most part, on a lot of these innovations, whether the innovation actually happened depended on things that you need to have well-educated people in the city. But if you can't get the funding to make the thing work, it doesn't happen. If you can't get early adopters to buy it, local demand as we call it, it doesn't really happen. And so many of the innovations happen afterwards. I'll give you an example. VisiCalc, which was the first electronic spreadsheet software, was one that was developed by somebody who had done, his academic work at MIT, and that's why he was in this area. But he got lots of work working for digital and other companies along the way. And while he came up with the idea while he was doing his MBA at MIT after working with digital, the work of actually making the software happen and then getting it distributed and bought and into the mainstream was not the result directly of MIT. It was the result of other things coming together, the 4 or 5 different key factors we call the bump and connect. And his story is that. I won't go on, but.
I would just add that one of the key things was networking. As I think you've mentioned, Boston Computer Society was a huge thing back then. It was all of the young and old people playing with the very first personal computers when there really wasn't much of an industry or a software. And these people were flocking to new ideas and helped get the very initial movement going for VisiCalc.
Mm-hmm. And his early funding, people he knew there, and the early purchases of the software were that. Eventually, one of those people introduced him to Steve Jobs, and that was the thing that had a double effect. One, Steve Jobs always said, if it weren't for Dan Bricklin and VisiCalc, people didn't have a reason to spend $2,000 on a personal computer because you could get an IBM Selectric for less and you knew how to work it. And it was the matching that Dan said, okay, I'm going to build this exclusively for Apple because I need to get people to buy the thing. And so you got your new Mac, I guess it was at the time, or your early one, with as the preferred thing. And so so anyhow, that's how you get something to grow out of something that he was talking about with the Boston Computer Society.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that you guys are talking about, of course, Dan Bricklin. He and Bob Frankston, for anybody who is listening and doesn't know, obviously the inventors of VisiCalc, one of the first spreadsheet programs, if not the first. I think it is the first. Why am I saying the one?
First.
One of. Anyway, but, they are very available around the Boston market. There's a lot of, going to an event and bumping into them. And the what did you call it? Bump and connect. Networking, and Boston is such a small physical area. People do bump into each other at events, and now we're in the midst of global pandemic, not so much on the physical events. Hey, Mass Innovation Nights, when was the last time you had a physical event? But, what are we looking at in terms of the impact on innovation out of our region after this year? I mean, are we going to see a dip, or perhaps we're going to see a bump because people have so much time on their hands now? No more commuting.
I'm in the bump camp, although really, who knows? But I do think there are a lot of people, sitting around rethinking a lot of things about what they do, what they care about, and how to do it. And we've all discovered how to even better use the communication tools we had. So I think there'll be a lot of that. But on the other hand, and I bet Bob will chime in on this, there's certainly something special about meeting in person. That's why people still have these gigantic trade shows. You don't necessarily have to have them, but there's something special about putting people all together and seeing what happens. So I think we are losing something, but I hope it won't be fatal.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, what did you say?
I'm wondering if you guys can talk a little bit about kind of the entrepreneurial or the innovation rules or truisms that you discovered with this whole project. Do you see any patterns that we can use?
Well, I think one of them is the idea that you really need to, in many situations, take on the existing thinking, and where you have something to add or change on that, it is important to bring that up and to make that happen. And going against the grain, being a serial entrepreneur and falling forward are all part of feeling that your idea may very well be the better idea than how people understand something right now. And the example that Alan had used before with the ARPANET, as it was called at BBN, was really an example of that. People just didn't feel that what they were trying to do with packets was necessarily going to work. And Licklider was somebody who really felt that, and he and a couple of other people in the BBN company really took something that Raytheon, which had wanted to work on that contract and didn't get it. Their ideas were not as advanced on this as a small company of people who are willing to see things differently. That is the essence of the innovation, and that is one of the things that we found going back to the 1630s, and why this particular town became the number one town in the United States for the first 100 years, and why we were the third largest port in the British Empire. I mean, we took on existing ideas at that point, and we won't get into all those histories of the shipbuilding and the this and that, and the Saugus Ironworks and other things, but went a very different route than the other colonies had gone.
Yeah, I would just, actually not being too original here, Bob often uses the phrase, I think, driving entrepreneur or someone that is absolutely the advocate for this. And I've certainly seen that in the stories we've written about. And in life, when I've written about entrepreneurs around the region, there's usually, if it's going to be successful, it has to be somebody who's really, driving this. Sometimes they're pretty ornery and unpleasant people, but not always. Sometimes they push things along through diplomacy and all kinds of other ways. But no matter what their style, they have to achieve that. They have to be able to move the ball and just keep going no matter what the obstacle is, because there are a lot of obstacles, as you know from working with innovators. It's not easy to innovate and get things off the ground, but that's crucial.
Absolutely. So, based on this project and your research, any specific recommendations for our more entrepreneurial listeners?
Get a regular job. Forget about it. Only kidding.
Great. Thanks, Alan.
Well, yeah, no. I mean, I think people are driven by curiosity, but a lot of people suppress that. I think the entrepreneurial, innovative types let that flow a little more, and before you know it, they're hooked and they want to take some idea or concept or pursue something that's a little out of the ordinary. They keep asking why or why not, and I think that's crucial. You can't spend all your time doing that. You have to get to the nitty gritty, but having that spark of excitement or enthusiasm about things, I think, is pretty crucial.
It is something where I've spent some time studying with some of the people in the innovation consulting business in Boston, looking at how your mind gets into a place where it can allow for something fairly different to come up as a result of thinking of something fairly common. And that process is one that everybody can do. 4 and 5 and 6-year-olds do it probably better than 40 and 50 and 60-year-olds. But that is the essence, really, of the innovation genie, and letting that out and encouraging people to brainstorm different ways is really the essence of, I think, great innovation. And that's part of where we see this bump and connect thing happening, that part of it that people normally focus on is sort of the leader in the idea of doing something. But where we've tried to say, based on our research, it's also being able to make the connection with people who can do the initial funding and having that happen, whether angel investors or venture capital or wherever. And it's also the depth of the networking that people do, and really hearing sort of those different ideas and letting those percolate in your head, which makes such a difference. And that's really the essence of it. A teeny story here, and one which I've learned from Alan, was what happened with Birdseye, the guy who really invented frozen foods in the United States. And he happened to be in Labrador, and seeing how the native indigenous people up there did ice fishing, and how incredibly cold, minus 40 degrees in the winter, and seeing that the fish that they brought out and were frozen there at that very low temperature tasted as good as the fresh fish. And the secret was getting much colder freezing equipment in order to make the frozen things taste good at the time. And the result was, frozen fish and then frozen peas. And he pioneered that in the supermarkets and corner stores in Springfield in 1932 or 31 or 33, whatever it was. And the result of it was something which really made a huge difference, and is one of the innovations, another of the innovations in this book. So, yeah.
That's great. Okay, so the book is Boston Made. Where can people find out more?
Well, they can find out more by seeing the cover and making sure that you know that the chocolate chip cookie is in the craw of the robot. Both of them from Massachusetts, but you can get it on Amazon, on Barnes and Noble, on websites, a number of bookstores that are still here and open. Brookline Booksmith and others have the book in stock, and we're happy to see that. And tomorrow's the day that they first put it on the shelves.
Great. And you have your own website, bostonmadebook.com, right?
bostonmadebook.com, right.
All right. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us today. And good luck with the book. And I hope that we hear more from you. So looking forward to more stories.
Okay.
Thank you, Bobbie.
Thank you very much, Bobbie. Yeah.